A very warm welcome once again, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and today I'd like to discuss a critical milestone in sustainable shipbreaking, and that is, of course, the Hong Kong Convention of 2009. The Hong Kong Convention for the safe and environmentally sound recycling of ships was adopted by the IMO in 2009 and is fundamentally there to address the environmental and safety challenges posed by ship recycling. It's a landmark treaty, and it aims to ensure that ships, when recycled after reaching the end of their operational lives, do not pose unnecessary risks to human health, to human safety, or indeed unnecessary risks to the environment. The convention essentially emerged in response to serious concerns over the dangerous and polluting practices often seen in major shipbreaking countries such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan and Turkey, where many end-of-life ships were dismantled and on beaches with little regard for worker safety or environmental protection. This resulted in deaths, injuries, and ultimately damage to the environment by leaving not just bits of ship lying around on the beaches where these ships were taken, but the contents of those ships being disposed of in a way that harmed both the marine environment and indeed the environment of the country in which the ship was taken. The rationale for such a convention goes back to the early 2000s, when ship recycling had become one of the most hazardous industrial sectors in the world. The practice of beaching a ship, which is of course bringing a large ship ashore for manual dismantling by running it up a beach, and on YouTube and other video platforms you can see videos of this happening. It's quite dramatic when very large ships are driven at speed at the beach in order to push them up as far as possible, ready for dismantling. This practice exposed workers to asbestos, heavy materials, residual fuels, often without adequate PPE. Of course, driving these ships up the beach caused coastal environments to suffer from contamination by hazardous waste, in particular polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, lead and oil residues. So in other words, this is hazardous waste coming from the paint and other materials used to coat the steel when the ship was born. The IMO, in collaboration with the International Labour Organization and the Basel Convention, which I'll talk a little bit about later on, recognised the need for legally binding international framework to try and manage the way in which these ships were being recycled. This led to the development of the Hong Kong Convention, which was adopted by the IMO back on the 15th of May 2009, however, has only just come into force in 2025. So, first of all, let's discuss why we had this rather long period of introduction of such a key convention. So, to try and explain this rather lengthy process of bringing in this convention, let's look at the way that the IMO actually adopts a new convention. So, first of all, there's an identification of the need for a new convention. Now, as we've already stated, the Hong Kong Convention on Recycling, the need was there due to the amount of coastal damage and risk posed to workers that were dismantling and recycling ships. Now, these needs are normally brought to the attention of the IMO by IMO member states, non-government organisations. An IMO subcommittee may identify the need for a new convention, or it could be in a response to a major incident. Titanic, of course, being a major contributor to the need to produce the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. So the need was there due to coastal damage and worker deaths and injuries. So the second stage is that a formal proposal of the convention is submitted to the IMO General Assembly, and if that proposal is accepted, then the issue that the convention refers to is normally referred to the relevant IMO committee, such as the Maritime Safety Committee or the Maritime Environmental Protection Committee. Now, because the Hong Kong Convention dealt with both environmental issues and safety issues, it was bouncing between committees in order to get full approval for development and drafting. The third stage is, of course, the development and drafting of the convention. It's normally done by a subcommittee and a working group with, again, inputs from non-government organisations such as technical bodies, classification societies, and other bodies interested in getting the convention right. And this development and drafting of the actual convention can take several years, obviously depending upon the complexity of the convention that's being developed. Once it has been developed, then it is reviewed and approved by the relevant committees that are there to ensure that the technical contents of the convention are absolutely spot on. Once that's the case, it approves the final draft of the convention, and the fifth stage is then adoption by an IMO assembly or a diplomatic conference. So fundamentally, in the case of the IMO, a IMO assembly is convened for new conventions, and it fundamentally requires a 2/3 majority of the governments that are present at that IMO assembly or diplomatic conference in order for the convention to be adopted by the IMO. Now, adoption by the IMO does not make a convention legally binding. So after adoption by the IMO, the convention is then subsequently opened up for signature and ratification by the IMO member states. Signatories are basically those countries that have perhaps contributed and support the convention, and ultimately ratification is where the individual member states take the requirements of the convention and write those requirements into their own national legislation. Only once a specific threshold is met of ratifications, not signatories. Signatories to a convention is just a promise. It's the actual declaration of ratification that is the important stage of a convention becoming law within a member state. Only once a specific threshold is met can that convention be enforced on an international basis. Normally, the threshold is a minimum number of states representing a certain percentage of world tonnage. It may sometimes have geographical or capacity criteria, which in fact the Hong Kong Convention did, because ship recycling happens in only a handful of member states. So ultimately, the Hong Kong Convention took 14 years for that process to happen. And this was due to a combination of political, economic, and fundamental practical challenges that were obvious when the requirements of the convention came to light. Now, the convention had very, very strict criteria before it could enter into force. So the convention had to be ratified by at least 15 states. Those 15 states must represent 40% of the world's merchant shipping by gross tonnage. And additionally, when it came to ship recycling, those states must have a recycling capacity of at least 3% of their fleets, which made it really, really hard to meet the threshold, since most ship recycling is concentrated in just a few countries. So the main countries that engage in ship recycling, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan and Turkey, were initially hesitant to ratify the convention. The things that stopped them doing it were essentially the cost of compliance, because their yards had to have new infrastructure with new safety and environmental standards put in place. They feared losing a competitive advantage to countries that actually had looser legislation than those that did not want to become a signatory to the convention or indeed ratify it. And of course, there was internal pressure in those countries from domestic shipbreaking industries who were resistant to the reforms, because this would ultimately mean that the operation costs more and therefore their bottom line wouldn't be quite as attractive. There were also enforcement and monitoring concerns, as some states feared that the convention lacked these enforcement mechanisms, and that too much reliance was placed upon the flag state of the individual ship to try and police the Hong Kong Convention. Then there was also a clash with the Basel Convention, which I'll explain a little bit about later on, as to what the Basel Convention is, because that's quite interesting. Now, the industry resistance to this particular convention was there for all to see, because essentially ship owners and cash buyers of ships that were reaching their end of life favoured the low-cost beaching options. And complying with the convention meant that they would have to have additional costs placed on ship owners for disposing of their ship, additional documentation which required survey, again that's extra costs. It would reduce the options for recycling to ship owners, meaning that they must dispose of their ship at approved recycling facilities. And then there was the potential disruption for the last voyage for scrap model. Now, the last voyage for scrap model is an interesting concept, in that in order to scrap your ship, then the ship would normally be reflagged so that scrapping it was made easier. In other words, flagged to a state that did not comply with either the Basel Convention or the Hong Kong Recycling Convention. And so therefore the last voyage for scrap would be put under duress by the Hong Kong Convention, because it would minimise the ability to do this. Now, this in itself could be a problem, and the Basel Convention saw these issues cropping up time and time again. Countries that were willing to be part of the Hong Kong Convention again needed time to upgrade their facilities. They needed time to develop their regulatory frameworks, and of course needed time to train personnel and to certify their own facilities under these new IMO compliant standards. So there was a real lack of early incentive to get the Hong Kong Convention into force, because ships could be scrapped elsewhere once countries started to show that they were complying. You know, there were fundamentally no penalties for non-compliance into force, so an individual state would not levy a penalty for allowing a ship to be recycled effectively illegally on its shores. And because there was no global standard to create this level playing field, these tearaway countries were able to essentially delay the implementation of the convention, because they could provide cheaper and more attractive ship recycling options. 2019 was the turning point really for the convention, because India ratified the convention in 2019. Bangladesh, which is the largest ship recycler, ratified it in 2023, which then pushed the convention over the threshold, and we entered a 2-year implementation period. That 2-year implementation period finished on the 26th of June 2025. So essentially, for the past 2 weeks, the Hong Kong Convention has been fully in force, having met the thresholds that were put in place at the beginning. To summarise this delay to the convention coming into force, these high thresholds, industrial resistance, the challenges of reforming a hazardous and what essentially was an informal global industry in very, very low-cost labour markets. These industries were basically existing within third world countries, and that made it very, very difficult for the Hong Kong Convention to get traction with these countries in order to invest the money necessary to provide the facilities for compliance. Now, I mentioned the Basel Convention as one of the hurdles for the Hong Kong Convention. The Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and their disposal is a very old convention. It was adopted way back in 1989 in Basel in Switzerland, and it fully entered into force on the 5th of May 1992. Now, this is nothing to do with the IMO. This is administered by the United Nations Environment Programme, and fundamentally the Basel Convention was brought into place to protect human health and the environment by minimising hazardous waste generation, ensuring that environmentally sound management of wastes took place. So this is not just ship waste, this is any kind of hazardous waste. And it prevented the illegal dumping of hazardous waste into poorer countries. Now, the key principles behind the Basel Convention is that there must be prior informed consent before hazardous waste is exported to a country. So a country must give written consent for that hazardous waste to be imported into it, or for a country to export it to that country. There must be a minimalisation of waste movement, so waste should be treated as close to its source as possible, so it doesn't have to be shipped around the world and dumped on another country. And therefore export is only allowed when the importing country has a better capacity to treat and deal with that hazardous waste safely. Within the Basel Convention, there was a prohibition of export to non-parties, so a country that was not a party to the convention could not import hazardous waste. This was prohibited unless a separate agreement existed. And the countries that were signatories to the Basel Convention must have ensured that all hazardous waste is handled in a way that protects people and the environment, similar in principle really to the Hong Kong Convention. Now, the Basel Convention covered a really wide range of hazardous wastes, including things like chemical wastes, heavy metals, lead, mercury, persistent organic pollutants, asbestos, waste oils, batteries, e-waste, electronic waste. Interestingly, it didn't cover radioactive waste, but it did have a relation to ship recycling, because at the end of the day, the Basel Convention treats end-of-life ships as hazardous waste if they contain anything that could be harmful to the country in which it's being exported and then imported to, and indeed the workers involved with the recycling of ships. So the Basel Convention essentially requires consent from an importing country before the ship can be sent for scrapping. And that in itself conflicted somewhat with how the Hong Kong Convention handled ship recycling, because it led to debates over legal loopholes, such as the last voyage loophole, where ships were reflagged or sold just before scrapping to avoid these Basel controls. So in other words, ships were reflagged to states that had existing agreements in place in order for them to circumnavigate the Basel Convention and allow that ship to be imported in. Fundamentally, the Hong Kong Convention would help to prevent this by ensuring that those countries that were importing the ships for scrapping were essentially signatories and had ratified the Hong Kong Convention. So, in short, the Basel Convention has been there for a long time to prevent environmental dumping in poorer countries, to hold the exporters of hazardous waste accountable for that hazardous waste, and essentially form the basis of many national hazardous waste laws. Hence why, when the Hong Kong Convention came along, a lot of countries found themselves in a position where they were having to adjust their own national legislation in order to comply with the new Hong Kong Convention on ship recycling. Just as a reminder, a ship that's being recycled is seen as hazardous waste under the Basel Convention, and that's why there is this slight conflict. Now, pretty much all UN member states are parties to the Basel Convention. 190 countries and the European Union were party to it. Significantly at the moment, the United States of America is not a party to the convention. So although it signed up to it in 1990, it has not ratified it, and therefore essentially isn't legally bound by the provisions. But the US, in kind of US style, has a lot of bilateral and regional agreements to manage hazardous waste exports in place, and that includes the export and recycling of ships. So let's get back to the Hong Kong Convention and talk a little bit about what the Hong Kong Convention essentially does. Now, the Hong Kong Convention applies to ships over 500 gross tons and above, engaged on international voyages, and of course, it applies to ship recycling facilities under the jurisdiction of a state that has ratified the convention. Don't forget, ratifying is taking the convention and writing those requirements into the national laws of the state. One of the prime objectives of the Hong Kong Convention is for ship owners to produce what's known as an inventory of hazardous materials, or IHM for short. Ships that are subject to the Hong Kong Convention must maintain an inventory of hazardous materials that fundamentally identifies the location and quantity of hazardous substances that are on board the ship. These hazardous substances could be asbestos, PCBs, ozone-depleting substances, heavy metals, lead, mercury, cadmium, hexavalent chromium, which is used to coat metals, and existing ships are required to develop an IHM before being recycled, but new ships must carry it from construction. Ships must also carry a ship recycling plan prior to recycling, and it must be developed based upon the IHM and submitted to the ship recycling facility prior to the ship being delivered to that facility for recycling. The plan must be approved by the relevant national authority within the country that the ship is going to be recycled in. Now, the Hong Kong Convention does require survey and certification. Ships must undergo an initial, renewal and final survey to ensure compliance, and the key certificates involved are an international certificate on inventory of hazardous materials, which is normally issued by a classification society on behalf of the flag state when the inventory of hazardous materials has been made, or if resurvey is done when the ship has any changes to it which may introduce additional materials which may be on the IHM. Second certificate that's required is an International Ready for Recycling certificate. This is a certificate that is issued again by class, normally on behalf of flag state, indicating that the ship is ready for recycling. Now, a lot of that depends upon the IHM, because the IHM has 3 parts, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Ship recycling facilities ashore must be authorised and certified by a competent national authority within the ratifying countries. And requirements for these ship recycling facilities include a ship recycling facility plan, worker safety protocols being put in place, emergency preparedness being there for in case of discovery of unexpected hazardous materials, or in the case of fire or other results from basically gas axing the ship up with a hazardous materials being in a space. Waste management procedures, obviously, and of course monitoring of the environmental standards in and around the facility itself. Now, workers must be protected. Under the UK legislation this would happen anyway, but under countries where there are not quite so many decent health and safety laws or decent medical care, the Hong Kong Convention requires facilities to ensure that, of course, there's proper training and proper PPE available for workers, that workers have access to a form of medical care to deal with any problems that arise from anything that comes out of the ships when they are being recycled, and of course an emergency response plan to deal with emergencies to protect workers when things do not go wrong. Facilities must manage waste in line with international standards, including the Basel Convention, and of course this prohibits the export of hazardous waste in violation of that treaty. So in other words, ships that are complying with the Hong Kong Convention are sending their ships to countries that also comply with the Basel Convention. In other words, we're not bypassing anything here. We're recycling the ship, and they're not allowing the hazardous bits of the ship to then be exported to a third world country for disposal there. As I said, it was a slow ratification process for the Hong Kong Convention, but it's now in force, having entered into force on the 26th of June 2025, and that, as I say, was due to that really rather long delayed ratification, as to why it's taken so long. Some critics argue that the Hong Kong Convention falls short of the Basel Convention's controls on hazardous waste, which allows pre-cleaning exemptions and relying really on flag state oversight, which can be weak, obviously, upon some open registries and flags of convenience who may not pay particular attention to where the ship was taken. The convention, the Hong Kong Convention, doesn't ban beaching, so beaching is still permitted underneath it. However, it does deal a lot with the environmental impact of beaching and tries to minimise where beaching can leave its own mark on the coastline. It does not mandate dry dock recycling in any way whatsoever. This would have been a step too far, because that would have made it almost impossible for countries like India and Pakistan to find the money in order to develop dry docks specifically for taking ships apart. Now, despite those limitations that I've just discussed, the Hong Kong Convention does set a really great baseline for the safe and environmentally sound recycling. And its implementation is, of course, expected to improve worker health and safety at these major ship recycling countries. It should reduce marine and coastal pollution, but most importantly, it will encourage transparency and accountability through certification and inventory requirements, so the ship owner can't get away with disposing of a ship that is full of hazardous material on a third world country that's not kitted out or prepared really to deal with that hazardous materials. Hopefully this will spur investment in safer facilities, particularly in South Asia, and encourage ship recycling centres to be more aligned with international standards, particularly on health and safety. It does represent a significant advancement in international maritime environmental law by establishing these clear responsibilities on ship owners, flag states and recycling facilities, and indeed the countries that house those recycling facilities. Its long overdue entry into force in 2025 now offers a real opportunity to try and transform the ship recycling industry into one that better regulates, particularly for workers. So just before we leave the subject, as promised, let's talk a little bit more about the inventory of hazardous materials. This is a key document to the implementation of the Hong Kong Convention. It's a very structured document which is carried on board a ship that lists all the hazardous materials known to be present. It lists their location and the approximate quantity. And the reason that we do this is to protect workers during ship recycling, to support the safe handling and disposal of hazardous substances, and to facilitate compliance with international regulations, including that notorious Basel Convention. The IHM consists of 3 parts. Part 1 is basically the materials that are present during the ship operation. So Part 1 is prepared at construction for new ships or via survey for existing ships, and it includes the hazardous materials contained in the ship's structure, its equipment, its systems, and of course its coatings. Part 2 of the IHM is about operationally generated wastes. This includes things like sludge, waste oils, sewage and garbage, and chemicals used on board the ship. Part 3 covers stores that are on board the vessel. So items used for the operation of the ship and stored, such as chemicals, paints and cleaning agents, refrigerants, and any spare parts that require spare parts that contain hazardous substances. Now, Part 1 must be with the ship for its life. If the ship's keel is laid now, then Part 1 must be there for life. Part 1 must also be surveyed for existing ships, and now that the Hong Kong Convention is in force, that survey must have already happened. But Parts 2 and 3, so operationally generated wastes and stores, are only required when the ship is being prepared for recycling. Now, sort of commonly used hazardous substances that you'll find on board ships are asbestos, which is a big one, which is obviously insulation, gaskets and pipe lagging. Ozone depleting substances in the refrigeration and air conditioning systems. Hexavalent chromium, which I mentioned before, is found in coatings and paints. Mercury and mercury compounds are found in thermometers, fluorescent lamps, things like that. Anti-fouling compounds such as TBT found in hull coatings. There may be what we call perfluorinated compounds, PFAS, which are actually found in firefighting foams. So these are just some examples as to the types of material that could potentially there. So for new ships, the IHM is developed by the shipbuilders and is based upon the material declarations and suppliers' declarations of conformity of the materials used, and is verified at an initial survey. For existing ships, it's prepared through a document review as well as visual sampling and checks of an existing ship, and conducted by a class society or an approved expert. Normally, a classification society would do the survey for an existing ship to prepare the IHM. Ships that are ready to be recycled, the updated IHM with Part 1 and Part 2 would normally be done by an approved expert appointed by a classification society and would be used to develop that ship recycling plan. So the initial survey happens to verify IHM Part 1 and issues the IHM certificate. A renewal survey should be conducted every 5 years, which updates the IHM. There should be an additional survey if there are any significant changes to the ship, such as retrofits of equipment containing hazardous materials. And of course, the final survey before recycling verifies that parts 2 and 3 are complete and helps to formulate the ship recycling plan. Now, we require an international certificate on inventory of hazardous materials, which of course is subject to initial and renewal surveys and a final survey, normally by the Classification Society. Just one note for UK flag ships on IHM. There was a bit of an issue with ship recycling when we had Brexit. So pre-2021, the UK was part of the EU's ship recycling regulation, which fundamentally meant that if a UK flag ship entered a European port, because we were part of the EU, then it was assumed that that UK ship had all its IHM requirements in place. Now, when Brexit happened after the 1st of January 2021, that was not the case, and UK ships were seen as third-party ships, which meant that UK regulation had to take that into account and ensure that things like the IHM requirement were there. Now, what this fundamentally meant was that the EU warned the UK that they must have new certificates issued to certify their own IHMs before ships came into European ports. Otherwise, under the port state control inspection, a UK ship may have been found to be non-compliant if it didn't have a UK issued IHM certificate. That came up very, very briefly in MCA orals some time ago, but since we're well past Brexit, now we're looking at the fundamental certification of the ship and the fundamental procedures for disposal of the vessel, i.e. IHM parts 2 and 3, the ship recycling plan, and compliance with the Hong Kong Convention itself. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this podcast. The Hong Kong Convention's only been in place for, whilst I'm making this podcast, the last 11 days. So it's a really new convention. And hopefully it's one that I think most importantly is going to improve the lives of workers within those countries who work on the dismantling and recycling of ships, and prevent them from coming into contact with materials that were incredibly hazardous. Yes, of course, it's there to protect the marine environments in these countries, and indeed shoreside environments in the countries. But primarily, I like to see the Hong Kong Convention as one that's making it safer for these guys to work on ships that are being dismantled in countries whose, let's say, safety record has not always been the best. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this podcast. I look forward to welcoming you again to the Maritime Education Podcast. In the meantime, have a great day.